Hey, what's up, everybody? XJW Tubers. This is Truth Survives 411. Checking in with you in this video. Wanted to talk a little bit about why do I think many Jehovah's Witnesses stay in the organization, despite things that maybe are coming into their consciousness, things that they're looking at, thinking about that may be troubling for them. Why do they stay anyway? I'm sure it's a multifaceted answer for various people based on various circumstances and situations, the background and all of those kinds of things. But my take is that many JWs stay because their self-awareness and their identity is so heavily entrenched in this organization and in this concept. If you are going to tell a person that has invested 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years in something, that now the pillars and anchors of that thing is coming to pieces, if you're going to tell them to now come out, well, what is essentially happening there? Well, that's almost an admission on their part that in some way they failed in terms of their awareness of what they really were involved in and the stability of what the organization is about. And for some of us, I think they take that as like a personal failing if they were to leave after all of that particular time and investment. Their identity is tied up in this thing. This is all they know. Can you imagine? This is all they know. And so, it's not a situation, in my opinion, it's not a situation where hundreds of thousands, maybe now even millions of JWs don't recognize many of the significant things that causes the organization to be brought into question. It's not that they don't see it, they don't understand it. It's just that, well, now what do I do? That's the big question that they're confronted with. Now what do I do? And so as opposed to having to answer that question and deal with the consequences of a decision such as to leave, well, like in many areas of society, they just swallow it. Or like the referees on the basketball court or the football field, they swallow the whistle. They swallow the whistle and basically say, well, I'm hopeful. I've heard this from people that are in the organization right now that I am very close to or was very close to. And they say, well, I'm just hopeful that Jehovah's going to work it out and the faithful and discreet slave are going to make some adjustments, and I want to be around for that. See, they're hoping for the happy outcome because ultimately, if anything else happens and they were to leave, well, it's for them a personal admission of failure. And that's, it's very troubling. I empathize with people that are in that place, as a doubting JW or a JW with their eyes open, but they're still a JW. And they don't want to leave. For some also, I think it's just a matter of self-esteem, Their self-esteem, their identity is attached to what they are as a Jehovah's Witness, perhaps also what they're doing in the organization as a Jehovah's Witness. For example, if you're talking about a sister and maybe she's a regular pioneer, she's held up in so much esteem in the congregation. Maybe she's used at the circuit level and, she gets all of this accolades and she can hear the crowds behind her. You can get addicted to that stuff. And to give that up because you now know that you're kind of sitting on some false pillars here, that takes some, as our former governor here said some years ago before he went to prison, Rod Blagojevich, that takes some testicular fortitude. And I'm sure you can appreciate the expression, but it's not easy. It's not easy. So I don't harshly judge anyone that decides to not necessarily make that move and leave the organization. While I personally feel like, on principle, they should, but I recognize that, of course, it's their choice, but I also recognize why it may be very difficult to do that. Because again, their self-esteem, their identity is tied up in this thing very heavily. When you're talking about a man, I mean, look at the organization. Frankly, now, as I see it, a very chauvinist organization with not a terribly large amount of respect for women in a lot of areas of the organization. But for men, it's even worse. If this man has had hands put on him, quote unquote, he's been appointed by Holy Spirit, as the saying goes, as a ministerial servant, an elder, regular pioneer, whatever it is, a Bethelite, missionary. He's been to the school for Christian couples or single brothers or whatever they call it these days. He's had these accolades put on him. His self-esteem now is tied up in what he's able to do in the congregation and stand on the stage and basically tell people how they should be living their lives. That is also something very difficult for them to unplug from. Again, recognizing the warts for what it is that they see within the organization, to leave that alone, because you now recognize that this was overreaching by not a little, but by a lot, is very difficult for some men, young men, older men, mature seniors. It's very difficult to leave that. Because again, it's in some ways, in their mind, it's an admission of failure. Now, in my mind, I've been working to come around to a way of thinking that says it's not really an admission of failure. To come to realize the organization is not what you thought it was and to exit. It's not a failure on my part. It simply is something that all of us as humans are subject to, which is we're subject to deception, and we're subject to a misplaced sense of obligation and sincerity that we think was based on some higher purpose. See Malcolm X. For any that have seen the movie or read the autobiography, here was a man that for many years, on the back end of coming out of prison, a person that saved him, right, in prison, he felt a sense of attachment and obligation to that person and to the organization that they brought him into, the Nation of Islam. And so he basically was blinded to some of the things that were supposedly happening in this organization, the Black Nation of Islam here in the United States. He was blinded. It took his wife and it took other people to try to wake him up and say, don't you see, these people aren't necessarily as sincerely attached to this idea of Islam as you thought they were. But he couldn't see it. Was that a failure on his part? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. He was looking at the fact that Elijah Muhammad and all these other people attached to the nation at the time, in his mind, they saved his life. And because they saved his life, he didn't feel he was in a position to question anything that was really going on, and he didn't pay attention to things that were going on. So, you could say it's a failure, but not really, because to me, failure would imply that you deliberately ignored something. And that's not really what happens with most JWs that wake up. Certainly wasn't my situation. So, again, I think that's another reason why people stay in and just, as it were, swallow the bad stuff, because ultimately their self-esteem, their identity is tied up in the organization. Many of these people, just to be quite frank with you, keep it 100, many of these people are of no note outside of the organization. They're not individuals that have accomplished anything either educationally or secularly as far as their career or work. They don't have anything like that going for them. They're, persona non grata, perhaps. They have very limited, personal qualities or abilities, perhaps in their view, that would allow them to be successful, outside of the organization. And so they're like, well, what's out there for me? What friends can I make? What people are going to like me? They go through these types of thought processes, in my view, having observed them for many, many years. They don't feel they have anything else outside of J-Dub land. What a sad thing. But of course, that's what many of us were trained and conditioned to believe and think. So as we move forward and try to heal, that's what we have to reaffirm. Quite simply, I am somebody. And me being somebody is not tied to my religious affiliation. It's not tied to a religious organization. But of course, that's an effort to get to the point where we really feel that and we feel comfortable with it and we can move forward. But I would submit to you that out of the 8 million or so Jehovah's Witnesses, there's probably a couple million that basically do not feel terribly confident that the organization is who they thought it was, but they will not leave, or they're not inclined to leave, because too much of their self-identity, too much of their self-esteem is attached to what they've been able to do perhaps within the organization, or just because they've been in it so long that they would hate to come out and essentially face the real world, and on some level feel like maybe someone's going to have them admit that you were, for some reason or other, a failure. And of course, again, I don't agree with that latter portion, that that's an accurate way to look at it, but I think that's the fear. That's what holds many of them in, is the idea that I missed big on this religion thing, and I am a failure for having stayed in it all this time and not really knowing what was going on, and now I have to come out here and rebuild. That is the trap of the organization and their indoctrination, which is what holds so many, I think, still in. So just my take on why it is I think so many are staying despite what they see, despite what their ears are telling them, their eyes are telling them, their heart. I think those are the reasons that holds them in, and yet what a sad thing, because they're missing the big picture and they're missing their real lives out here by not really fully waking up to what's going on inside of JW land. So just my take. Feel free to comment or let me know what you think or why you think many are held in. But I think these are the things, along with, of course, many others that we can speak to: the potential for shunning, losing family, those kinds of things. But outside of those, I think these are some of the things that really hold people in. But be interested in your thoughts.